In 2018, Nielsen Holdings Incorporated declared that hip-hop was the most popular genre of music. Hip-hop owes part of this popularity to a subgenre called trap, which is characterized by its complicated hi-hat patterns, dark subject matter, and heavy bass kick drums. This punchy kick drum was originally derived from a drum machine called the TR-808. While the sounds from this machine have become ubiquitous in modern music, did you know that this machine was a commercial disaster when it was first released? In addition to that, trap music and many hip-hop movements from the South of the United States were often ignored and sometimes actively put down by many people, including some respected hip-hop artists. So how did what was originally considered a catastrophe of an invention propel the outcasts of hip-hop music to the top of not just the nation, but the entire planet?
This is the Omuzika podcast.
The year is 1960, and we begin our journey in Osaka, Japan, where a Japanese engineer and entrepreneur, Ikutaro Kakehashi, founds the company Ace Electronics Industries, more commonly known as Acetone in the United States. It was at this company that he oversaw the release of the R1 Rhythm Ace drum machine in 1964. This machine was inspired by an earlier invention, the Sideman, which is generally considered to be the first ever drum machine. Invented in 1959, the Sideman was a product of the U.S. organ manufacturer Wurlitzer. While the Sideman used vacuum tube circuitry and a rotating metal disc to generate sounds, Kakehashi's invention used a brand new piece of technology called the transistor. In fact, it is widely believed that the R1 Rhythm Ace was the first commercially available drum machine to feature the transistor. Kakehashi presented the invention at the National Association of Music Merchants in Chicago that same year. Exciting as this invention was, no distribution deals were ever signed. Acetone were back in 1967 with the Rhythm Ace FR1, which featured 16 presets which could be mixed and matched to generate interesting new combinations. In contrast to their first drum machine, this one gained a few admirers, including musicians like British musician Robin Gibb, who used it in his song Saved by the Bell. The company decided to sell this machine to another US-based organ company, Hammond. In his autobiography, I Believe in Music, Kakehashi describes the success of the FR1 as a turning point. By the 1970s, thanks to the work of Kakehashi and a few other collaborators and rivals, drum machines were slowly beginning to gain popularity among musicians. Kakehashi left Acetone in 1972 after the company gained new owners that didn't seem to share his passion for electronic musical instruments. Only a month later, he formed the Roland Electronics Corporation. Roland released a few drum machines that never really gained any serious momentum. The breakthrough came with the CR-78 drum machine in 1978. This machine was used in Blondie's 1979 hit Heart of Glass, which reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and later on in the 1981 mega hit In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins. With the success of this and a few other instruments that I do not have time to mention, Roland were left as a well-established player in the electronic musical instruments market by the end of the 1970s. In 1980, Roland released this.
Introducing the world's most advanced rhythm machine, the Roland TR-808, a revolutionary computer-controlled rhythm machine offering more percussive variations and effects than virtually any other machine on the market. Rhythm pattern visualization, built-in memory, realistic sounds, synchronous performance. Roland, we design the future.
The TR-808 was marketed as a cutting-edge futuristic drum machine. Engineers at the company made the decision to use analog circuits to generate sounds instead of sampling sounds and storing them on expensive memory chips. This meant that sounds on this machine were incredibly versatile and could be customized to the producer's preference. Now, given Roland's massive reputation, sales were incredibly disappointing. This was partly due to the fact that most musicians at the time seemed to prefer the more realistic sounds being offered by the more expensive Lin M1 drum machine. Also, Roland had used faulty transistors in their original models, which gave the machines their characteristic sizzle. These transistors became virtually impossible to source, and so in 1983, after releasing only 12,000 models, Roland decided to pull the plug on the TR-808. Although the TR-808 was a commercial failure, it did get used in a few hits, including Sexual Healing by R&B legend Marvin Gaye and Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa. Bambaataa's 1982 hit sparked a musical revolution across the country, inspiring many producers to ditch attempted realism in favor of more blatant artificiality. One of the earliest adopters of the booming bass kick were hip-hop producers in New York. You can observe the use of the 808 in 80s hip-hop songs, such as the Beastie Boys song Hold It Now, Hit It. Eventually, the 808 fell out of favor with producers in the birthplace of hip-hop and was forced to find solace in other areas. One of those areas was Miami, Florida. While it is difficult to say who exactly started the Miami bass subgenre, a lot of scholars credit MC-ADE's 1985 song Bass Rock Express as the first truly popular Miami bass song. A year later, the genre was pushed further, first with the release of the Curtis Mantronix produced song Bass Machine, which had Tila Rock providing the lyrics, and then with the debut album of a group called Two Live Crew. The album was called Two Live Crew Is What We Are, and the lead single, Throw the D, is generally regarded to have provided the blueprint for the subgenre's sound, which included the blasting bass drums from the TR-808. Now, in case you're mature and your mind is not already in the gutter, the D in the title of the song is a euphemism for a male reproductive organ. Two Live Crew's music was famous for having very generous amounts of sexual references baked into their music. This tactic brought them more notoriety, but also more fame, as is often the case in the music world. They got into more trouble and more fame with their third album, As Nasty As They Wanna Be, which had the lead single, Me So Horny. The album was so controversial that courts banned the sale of the album, and the group had an entirely clean version of the album made. This did wonders for the subgenre, pushing it even further into the regional spotlight. While the original incarnation of the group eventually broke up in 1992, Miami bass's popularity was sustained by other talented acts like DJ Magic Mike, Clay D the Beatmaster, and Disco Rock, right up to the mid-90s. While Miami bass and the sounds of the 808 were capturing the attention of many fans, the 808 found another place of refuge, New Orleans, Louisiana. It is here that a musical movement called Bounce was born. It is interesting to note that the movement was actually started by a group that wasn't even from the area. A New York rap group called the Showboys released the song Drag Rap in 1986, which also made heavy use of the 808. While this song barely made a splash in New York, it was very well received in the southern areas of the United States, particularly New Orleans. Around the same time period, a group with the name New York Incorporated gets formed by a New York transplant, Denny D. The group was comprised of Denny D himself, DJ Wop, Polo B, who later changed her name to Maya X, and DJ Manny Fresh. DJ Manny Fresh is credited with helping the subgenre effloresce and bringing the sounds of New Orleans to a national audience. The group New York Incorporated disbanded shortly after, and Manny Fresh teamed up with another rapper, Gregory D. This duo then continued to lead the movement, dropping regional hits such as Buck Jump Time and Where You From in 1989. This group also disintegrated, and Manny Fresh decided to leave New Orleans and spend some time in LA under the tutelage of Chicago house legend Steve Silk Hurley. Bounce continued its trudge forward, with songs like Where They At by DJ Irv and MCT Tucker capturing the attention of club audiences. The next event we'll talk about was the foundation of Cash Money Records. The company was founded around 1991 by Ronald and Brian Williams, aka Slim and Baby. One of their first moves was to formally recruit DJ Manny Fresh as the label's only producer. At the label, he started to tinker with his music with the view of appealing to national musical sensibilities. For a while, Cash Money Records were not too successful, at least compared to other local record labels like Big Boy Records and No Limit Records. That was soon to change. In 1996, Cash Money Records decided to drop a sizable portion of their roster and sign Terrius Gray, aka Juvenile. In 1998, they dropped his second album with the label, 400 Degrees, entirely produced by DJ Manny Fresh. This album went on to become one of the most influential hip-hop albums coming from New Orleans, peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Hip Hop R&B 200 chart. The two lead singles on the album, Ha and Back That Ass Up, also did very well on the Billboard Hot 100. With the sounds of New Orleans now firmly lodged in the nation's attention, DJ Manny Fresh continued to play an instrumental role in the popularization of the subgenre and the great success that the label enjoyed, producing virtually all of Cash Money Records' projects from 1992 to 2005, including those of Hot Boys and Lil Wayne. Another major location we will focus on is Houston, Texas. Houston hip-hop had enjoyed a reasonable amount of success fairly early on in the late 80s. This was primarily driven by a group called the Ghetto Boys, who gained national recognition for their profoundly controversial music around the late 80s and early 90s. However, our subject of focus is another music producer from Smithville, Texas, going by the name DJ Screw. Around the turn of the decade, DJ Screw stumbled on a technique which involved slowing down music tracks and then only repeating a few lines throughout the song. A very different style from the word pack creations that were coming from New York City. This technique, which was later called chopped and screwed in his honor, quickly became very popular in the area, with many people willing to spend money and long waiting hours for his creations. DJ Screw eventually moved to Houston and throughout the 90s sold his unique style of music to fans and aspiring musicians alike. By the mid-90s, rappers began to rap over these creations. By the end of the 90s, DJ Screw and his production technique had been involved in the launch of many rappers' careers, including ESG, Big Hawk, Fat Pat, Zero, Big Mo, and Trey the Truth. Another Texas native whose contribution we will focus on is Pimp C. Originally from Port Arthur, Texas, Pimp C recalls that he began making hip-hop beats fairly early when he received a drum machine and a keyboard for Christmas. He teamed up with a rapper who went by the name Bun B and formed the duo Underground Kings, UGK. With UGK, Pimp C earned a reputation for incorporating blues, soul, and gospel elements into hip-hop production. In addition to that, he deviated from classic kick-snare combination of New York and opted for claps, hi-hats, and, you guessed it, 808 kicks for his compositions. These techniques were capably demonstrated on their 1994 album Super Tight and on their 1996 album Rad and Dirty, which eventually attracted the attention of many outside the Houston area. UGK went on to enjoy a substantial amount of commercial success by the end of the 90s, most notably being featured on mega hits such as Jay-Z's Big Pimpin' and 3 6 Mafia's Sippin' on Some Scissor. Now, arguably the most recognizable influence of the trap genre came from Memphis, Tennessee. Contrary to popular belief, rap in Memphis did not originate with the horrorcore group 3 6 Mafia. The scene started just a little before them. It is plausible to believe that the scene began when club DJs like DJ Spanish Fly, Sony D, and Ray the J began playing Miami bass and Houston hip-hop music in clubs around the late 80s. When club DJs noticed that crowds gravitated towards darker and heavier sounds, they began experimenting with increasingly darker subject matter and heavier bass lines. A duo of DJs, DJ Paul and Juicy J, who later became part of 3 6 Mafia, began to participate in this musical experimentation. They noticed that when they played certain kinds of music, crowds would react aggressively. After forming the group 3 6 Mafia in 1991 with rapper Lord Infamous and Juicy J, DJ Paul worked on the production of a few projects, the most notable being Lord Infamous' album Come With Me to Hell in 1993. In 1995, armed with the knowledge about club behavior, DJ Paul with 3 6 Mafia released the album Mystic Styles, which is generally regarded to have standardized the formula for a new subgenre, crunk. This subgenre would be perfected in another area of the United States, with 3 6 Mafia also enjoying some of the success that would come as a result of this new subgenre's popularity. Miami bass, New Orleans bounce, Houston's slow, thick production, and a prototype for crunk music from Memphis were all ready for export. Their destination? Atlanta. Before the 90s, Atlanta's hip-hop scene wasn't very sonically distinct from the Miami scene. This started to change when DJs like King Edward J, Kilo Ali, and DJ Smurf, who later changed his name to Mr. Collie Park, began to play songs with heavier bass presence. Mr. Collie Park, in particular, is thought to have begun layering 808 drum patterns over Quiet Storm and R&B music around the early 90s. Mr. Collie Park releases the single To the Walls in 1992, which had a chant that would later be popularized by another artist. In 1993, he releases the album The Comeback, which was a collaboration with New York rapper MC Shy D. Around the same time, other rap acts were also participating in the shaping of the new scene. One of these acts was Goody Mob, telling thoughtful stories about unemployment and the depressing life of surviving poverty. Some say that it was Goody Mob who brought the term trap to a broader audience in their song Thought Process, one of the songs that featured on their 1995 debut, Soul Food. Back to crunk, which had another big push in 1996 when a club DJ by the name of Lil Jon is given permission by Atlanta music legend Jermaine Dupri to curate the compilation album So Death Bass All Stars. Lil Jon noticed that the music on this compilation and certain other songs coming from the Memphis scene would get very energetic responses from crowds whenever they were played in clubs. The next year, Lil Jon oversaw the production of the album Get Crunk Who You With, a joint venture with rappers Big Sam and Lil Bo, who would henceforth be called the East Side Boys. It wasn't until the early 2000s that crunk gained national attention when Lil Jon and the East Side Boys teamed up with Yin Yang Twins on the song Get Low, which reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Crunk enjoyed a short reign of dominance throughout the mid-2000s, influencing a few other different genres. However, right at the turn of the decade, another genre which would have an even greater impact, was just getting underway. With bass-heavy music, dark and dreary lyrical subject matter, thick production already becoming a common fixture in the Atlanta area, it is possibly unknowable to know for sure who the first producer to deviate from crunk and establish trap as a wholly separate entity was. A strong case can be made for Atlanta producer Shawty Redd, who in the year 2000 produces the album Causing Drama for an Alabama rapper called Drama. Although this album contained very little lyrical references to drug dealing, it is thought to have been the first hip-hop album to merge complex hi-hat patterns with 808 bass kicks and thick accompaniments. It is not far-fetched to think that producers in the area probably took notice of Shawty Redd's formula, given the moderate buzz this album generated upon release. In 2003, we arrive at what is believed to be the first spectacularly commercially successful trap album, Trap Music, released by T.I. The album was largely produced by DJ Toomp, who had actually worked on Miami bass and crunk music in the past. This new genre received further attention with the success of other albums from Atlanta rappers, most notably Trap House by Gucci Mane and Let's Get It, Thug Motivation by Young Jeezy, both released in 2005, curated by producers that included Shawty Redd, again, Zaytoven, and Drummer Boy. By the mid to late 2000s, popularity for this music just continued to grow, and southern acts from outside Atlanta, like Rick Ross and Lil Wayne, started adopting this new sound. By the beginning of the 2010s, the 808 sounds were now becoming mainstream. By now, the sounds of the machine had migrated to digital audio workstations on personal computers, which made them even easier to manipulate and customize. This new movement was now being popularized by a new crop of producers, which included Lex Luger, Mike Will Made It, Southside, TM-88, Sony Digital, Young Chop, DJ Spins, Tay Keith, and Metro Boomin. Many of these producers went on to dominate the Billboard charts and even influence other genres throughout the mid-2010s. It is ironic to think that a machine that sold so poorly that it didn't even feature on the company's 25th anniversary catalog had taken over the planet under the supervision of producers and artists from a part of the country that was rarely taken seriously in the hip-hop world. The sounds of the 808 have come to dominate our speakers and continue to do so to this day. As of 2022, trap has also sired a new subgenre, drill, which still uses the same 808 sounds. While we cannot say if Ikutaro Kakehashi achieved his dream of creating the ideal musical instrument, he definitely did oversee the invention of one of the most influential ones.
Hello, thank you for listening. If you really like what you have just heard, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you really like what you hear, why not consider supporting the Omuzika podcast on Patreon? Once again, thank you so much for listening.